You never forget the sound of your own son's voice asking a question that changes everything. Mine came on a Tuesday evening in November, in a small diner off Route 9, under fluorescent lights that hummed just a little too loud, while rain tapped against the window like it was trying to get our attention. My name is Gareth Holloway, and I want to tell you what happened that night, because it is the reason my life looks the way it does today, and it is the reason I believe, more than anything else, that the smallest moments are the ones that end up mattering the most. I was 34 years old back then, raising my son Hollis on my own. His mother, Adela, passed away when he was 5, taken by an illness that moved faster than any of the doctors expected, faster than I was ever ready for. One day, she was humming while she made pancakes, and 3 months later, I was standing in a cemetery in a suit that didn't fit right, holding my son's small hand while he asked me why everyone was crying. I didn't have an answer for him then. Some nights I still don't. After she died, it was just the two of us. I worked long hours at a hardware store on Miller Street, the kind of place where the owner still wrote receipts by hand. And every Tuesday, because it was the one night I didn't work late, Hollis and I would go to Dot's Diner for dinner. It became our thing, our little tradition. He would get the grilled cheese, always cut into triangles, and I would get the meatloaf, and we would sit in the booth by the window and talk about his day, his teachers, the science project he was building out of popsicle sticks, whatever was on his 8-year-old mind. Those Tuesday nights were the glue that held us together. They were the 1 hour of the week where grief didn't sit at the table with us. That particular Tuesday started like any other. The rain had been falling since morning, one of those cold November rains that seeps into your bones and makes the whole world feel gray. We walked into Dot's, shook the water off our coats, and slid into our usual booth. Hollis ordered his grilled cheese. I ordered my meatloaf, and we started talking about nothing in particular, the way you do when the world feels safe and small, and yours. That's when I noticed him go quiet. Hollis was staring out the window, past the raindrops sliding down the glass, past the streetlight, flickering on the wet pavement, toward the bus stop bench across the street. I followed his gaze, and saw her, an old woman, sitting alone on that bench, no umbrella, no coat that looked warm enough for the weather, her shoulders hunched forward, like she was trying to fold herself smaller against the cold. She had a plastic bag beside her, the kind you get from a grocery store, and it looked like it held everything she owned in the world. "Dad," Hollis said, not looking away from the window. "Is she gonna be okay out there?" I didn't know what to say. I told him I wasn't sure, that sometimes there are people who don't have anywhere warm to go, and that it was sad, but that we couldn't fix every sad thing we saw. It sounded weak, even as I said it. It sounded like the kind of thing adults say when they don't want to deal with something. Hollis didn't say anything for a long moment. He just kept watching her, and then he turned to me, his eyes serious in a way that 8-year-old eyes shouldn't have to be, and he asked the question that I will remember for the rest of my life. "Dad, can she eat with us?" I want to be honest with you about what went through my mind in that moment, because I am not proud of all of it. Part of me thought about the cost, about how tight money already was, about the fact that I had exactly enough in my wallet to cover our dinner and a little gas money to get through the week. Part of me thought about the awkwardness of walking up to a stranger and inviting her inside. Part of me, the tired, grieving, overwhelmed part of me, wanted to just tell him no, finish our dinner, and go home. But then I looked at my son's face. I looked at the way he was watching that woman, like she mattered, like her comfort was somehow his responsibility, even though he was 8 years old and had no business carrying that kind of weight. And I thought about Adela. I thought about the woman I married, who used to say that kindness was the only thing in this world that multiplies the more you give it away. I thought about what she would have done if she were sitting in that booth instead of me. I stood up. "Wait here," told Hollis, and I walked out into the rain without my coat, because I didn't want to waste the seconds it would take to grab it. The woman looked up at me when I approached, and I saw the exhaustion in her face before I saw anything else. Deep lines carved by years I didn't know anything about. Eyes that were wary, guarded, the eyes of someone who had learned the hard way that strangers weren't always safe. Her name, I would learn later, was Verna Castello, and she was 68 years old. "Ma'am," I said, feeling suddenly foolish, and sure how to say what I meant to say. "My son noticed you sitting out here, and he asked if you'd like to come inside and eat with us. It's warm in there, and there's no charge, no catch. We'd just like the company, if you're willing." Verna looked at me for a long moment. I could see her trying to decide if I was telling the truth, if this was some kind of trick, if kindness like this even existed anymore in a world that had not been kind to her in a very long time. Her hands were trembling, and I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or something else. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice rough, like it hadn't been used much that day. "Honestly," I said, "because my son asked me to, and he's usually right about things that matter." Something in her face shifted. Then, not quite trust, not yet, but something close to it. She nodded, slowly, gathered her plastic bag, and followed me inside. When we walked back into the diner, Hollis's whole face lit up in a way that made every ounce of my hesitation feel foolish. He scooted over in the booth to make room, and Verna sat down across from him, still clutching her bag like she was afraid someone might take it from her. The waitress, a kind woman named Odessa, who had worked at Dots for as long as I could remember, came over without a word about the situation. Just took Verna's order like she was any other customer, and I will never forget the small kindness in that. The way Odessa didn't make a scene, didn't make Verna feel like a charity case, just treated her like she belonged there. Verna ordered a bowl of soup, the cheapest thing on the menu, even though I told her to get whatever she wanted. At first, she barely spoke. She ate slowly, carefully, like she wasn't sure when her next meal might come, like she was trying to make it last. Hollis, being Hollis, filled the silence with questions, the way only a child can, without any of the awkwardness adults carry into these situations. "Do you have a favorite color?" he asked her. Verna blinked, surprised by the question. "Yellow," she said quietly, "like sunflowers. I used to grow them." "You had a garden?" "I did. A long time ago." Her voice caught slightly. "Before things changed, I didn't push. I let Hollis's easy curiosity do what my adult caution couldn't." And slowly, piece by piece, over the course of that dinner, Verna began to open up. She told us she had been a schoolteacher for 31 years, taught 3rd grade in a town 2 hours from where we sat. She told us about her husband, Roscoe, a good man who had passed away 6 years earlier from a heart attack while working in that very sunflower garden she mentioned. She told us, with a kind of quiet shame that broke my heart, that after Roscoe died, her son had moved across the country, that they had a falling out over money and old grievances that neither of them had ever managed to repair, and that without her husband's pension and without family nearby, she had lost her apartment 8 months ago when her savings ran out. "I never thought this would be my life," she said, staring down at her empty soup bowl. "I taught children to read. I had a home, a husband, a garden full of yellow flowers, and now I sit on benches and hope somebody doesn't call the police on me for existing in the wrong place." I didn't know what to say to that. Sometimes there isn't anything to say. Sometimes the only right thing to do is to sit there and let someone's pain exist in the room, without trying to fix it too quickly. Hollis, though, reached across the table and put his small hand on top of hers. "You can be our friend," he said simply. "Everybody needs a friend." I watched something break open in Verna's face, watched tears well up in her eyes, tears she tried to blink back, tears of a woman who had not been offered simple kindness in longer than she could probably remember. She didn't say anything for a long moment. She just nodded and held onto my son's small hand like it was the only solid thing in a world that had been shifting beneath her feet for months. That night, I didn't just say goodbye to Verna and go home feeling good about myself. I couldn't. I kept thinking about her sitting on that bench in the rain, about where she would sleep that night, about the fact that come Wednesday morning, nothing about her situation would have changed, just because one family bought her a bowl of soup. So before we left the diner, I did something I hadn't planned on doing. I asked her if she had anywhere to stay. She admitted, quietly, that she had been staying at a shelter across town when there was room, and sleeping at the bus station when there wasn't. I thought about my house, the spare room that used to be my home office before I gave up freelancing on the side, the room that had been sitting empty and unused since Adela passed. I thought about what it would mean to open that door to a stranger, and I thought about what Adela would have said if she could see me hesitating. I offered Verna the spare room, just for a few nights, I told her, just until she could figure out a better plan. She protested, said she couldn't accept something like that from strangers, said she didn't want to be a burden. But Hollis, sitting there in his booster seat with grilled cheese crumbs on his shirt, looked up at her and said the words that finally broke through her resistance. "You're not a stranger," he said. "You ate dinner with us. That makes you family now." Verna cried again that night, right there in the parking lot of Dot's Diner, standing in the rain that had finally slowed to a drizzle. And I found myself crying too, for reasons I couldn't fully explain, except that maybe, for the first time since Adela died, I felt like our little broken family of two was doing something that mattered, something bigger than just surviving. Those few nights turned into a few weeks. Those few weeks turned into months. Verna insisted on helping around the house, cooking dinners that reminded me of meals my own grandmother used to make, helping Hollis with his reading homework in the evenings with the same patience she must have shown hundreds of students over the years. She never once acted like she was entitled to be there every single day. She thanked us, like she still couldn't quite believe her luck, like she was waiting for the day we would change our minds. We never did. Those first weeks were not without their difficulties. Verna was proud, fiercely so, and there were mornings I would find her sitting at the kitchen table with her coat still on, as if she expected to be asked to leave at any moment, as if comfort itself was something she didn't quite trust. She would apologize for using too much hot water in the shower, apologize for the sound of her footsteps on the stairs at night, apologize for existing in a space she still felt she hadn't earned. It took time, more time than I expected, for her shoulders to finally settle, for her to stop flinching slightly whenever I walked into a room unannounced. I remember one evening in early December, maybe 3 weeks after that first dinner, when I came home late from a shift at the hardware store and found her sitting at the kitchen table across from Hollis, helping him with the school assignment about family trees. He was supposed to draw branches representing his relatives, and he had drawn one for his mother, one for me, and then, without any hesitation at all, he had drawn a branch for Verna and labeled it, in his careful 8-year-old handwriting, Grandma Verna. I stood in the doorway and watched her stare at that piece of paper for a long time, her hand pressed against her mouth, before she quietly excused herself to the bathroom, heard the water running for several minutes. When she came back, her eyes were red, but she was smiling in a way I hadn't seen from her before. "Nobody has called me that in a long time," she told me later, after Hollis had gone to bed. "Not since my own grandchildren stopped visiting." I didn't think I would ever hear those words again. That was the night I stopped thinking of her arrangement in our home as temporary. I never said the words out loud, not yet, but something inside me had already decided that Verna Castello was not leaving, not unless she wanted to. Winter passed slowly, the way winters do when you are paying attention every small moment, instead of rushing through them. Verna took over most of the cooking, insisting it gave her purpose, and our kitchen filled with smells I hadn't experienced since I was a child myself. Cornbread and chicken and dumplings, pies with crusts so flaky they nearly fell apart before you could get a bite to your mouth. She taught Hollis how to crack an egg without getting shell in the bowl, how to knead dough with the heel of his hand, and in doing so, she gave him something I hadn't realized he was missing: a quiet patient kind of attention that came without any rush or distraction. Spring came, and with it, Verna asked if she could plant something in the small patch of dirt behind our house that I had never done anything with. I told her to do whatever she wanted with it. Within a few weeks, there were sunflower seedlings pushing up through the soil, and I watched my son water them every morning before school, taking the responsibility as seriously as any job he'd ever had. Verna would sit on the back steps some evenings, watching Hollis tend to those seedlings, and she would tell him stories about her husband Roscoe, about the garden they had built together over 30 years of marriage, about the way Roscoe used to whistle old country songs while he worked the soil. She told him about her years teaching third grade, about students who had gone on to become doctors and firefighters, and once, even a senator, and how she still remembered every single one of their names, even decades later. Hollis soaked up every word like the seedlings soaked up the water he gave them each morning, and I began to notice something remarkable happening in my son. He was growing kinder. Not that he hadn't always had a good heart, but there was a patience developing in him, a thoughtfulness in the way he treated people that I recognized as something Verna was quietly, gently teaching him, the same way she must have taught hundreds of children before him. But I want to tell you about the day everything truly changed. The day I understood just how much Verna had become a part of us, not out of pity, not out of obligation, but out of something that felt a lot like love. It was late June, nearly 8 months after that rainy Tuesday, when Hollis got sick, really sick. A fever that climbed past 103, vomiting that wouldn't stop, a limpness in his body that terrified me in a way I hadn't felt since Idela's diagnosis. I was frantic, fumbling with my phone to call for an ambulance, my hands shaking too badly to dial correctly. Verna took the phone from my hands, calm in a way that only comes from decades of experience, and told me she had spent years dealing with sick children in her classroom, that she recognized the signs, that this looked like it could be appendicitis, and that we needed to get him to the hospital immediately, not wait for an ambulance that might take 20 minutes to arrive. She was right. She helped me get him into the car, kept him talking and conscious the entire drive, kept me calm enough to actually drive safely, and by the time we reached the emergency room, the doctors confirmed exactly what she suspected. His appendix had ruptured. Another hour, they told us, and the outcome could have been very different. I sat in that hospital waiting room that night with Verna beside me, her hand on my shoulder, the same way Hollis's small hand had once rested on hers in that diner booth, and I understood something I hadn't fully let myself understand before. This woman, this stranger we had invited in out of the rain, had just helped save my son's life. The kindness we offered her that Tuesday evening had come back to us in a way I never could have imagined, in the form of a woman whose steady hands and years of experience made the difference between a scare and a tragedy. Hollis recovered fully within a couple of weeks, and something in our little household shifted permanently. After that, Verna stopped being our guest and became, in every way that mattered, our family. She was there for his first day of middle school, standing on the porch, waving until the bus disappeared around the corner. She was there for my promotion at the hardware store, the one that, finally, let us breathe a little easier financially. She was there on the anniversary of Idela's passing, the hardest day of the year for both Hollis and me, sitting quietly with us, not trying to fill the space where his mother should have been, just making sure we didn't sit in that grief alone. Years passed this way. Verna aged, as we all do, her steps growing slower, her hands growing more careful with the years, but her heart never changed. She taught Hollis to read the way she once taught her students, patiently, knowingly, correcting his mistakes without ever making him feel small. She taught him to garden, and by the time he was 13, our small backyard was filled with sunflowers every summer, tall and golden, and turning their faces toward the sun, just like the ones she used to grow with her husband Roscoe so many years before. I want to tell you that this story has a simple, happy ending, but life is rarely that simple, and the truest Stories are the ones that hold both joy and sorrow in the same hand. 5 years after that rainy Tuesday night, when Hollis was 13 years old, Verna's health began to decline. Her heart, the doctors told us, the same condition that had taken her husband Roscoe, was failing. We spent that final year making sure she never spent a single day feeling like a burden, the way she once feared she would be. We took her to see the ocean for the first time in decades. We celebrated a birthday that turned into the biggest celebration our small house had ever seen, with half the neighborhood showing up because somehow, in 5 years, Verna had become beloved by everyone she met. On the night she passed, she was not sitting alone on a bench in the rain. She was in our home, in the room that had once been my empty office and had become, in every real sense, hers. Hollis sat on one side of her bed, holding her hand, the same hand he had reached across a diner table to hold when he was 8 years old. I sat on the other side, and in her final hours, weak but smiling, she told us that the best thing that had ever happened to her, in a life that included 31 years of teaching children and a marriage full of love and a garden full of sunflowers, was a little boy in a diner who looked at a stranger and saw a person worth caring about. You asked if I could eat with you, she whispered to Hollis that night, her voice barely above a breath. That question saved my life. She passed peacefully before morning, surrounded by the family she found on a rainy Tuesday in a diner booth. A family that began with 4 simple words, spoken by an 8-year-old boy who hadn't yet learned that the world sometimes teaches us to look away from people who are struggling. I think about that night often, about how close I came to giving him the easy answer, the tired answer, the answer that would have let us finish our dinner and go home without ever knowing Verna Castello existed. I think about how one small act of kindness, one decision to listen to my son, instead of my own exhaustion, gave us 8 more years with a woman who ended up teaching my son more about love, patience, and grace than I ever could have taught him alone. I think about how she saved his life that summer, and how, in a way, he had already saved hers. Hollis is 21 years old now, studying to become a teacher himself, following in the footsteps of a woman who wasn't his blood, but was every bit his family. He keeps a small photo of Verna in his wallet, standing among her sunflowers, smiling in a way she rarely smiled during those first difficult months we knew her. Every summer, we still plant sunflowers in that same patch of dirt behind the house, and every summer, when they bloom, I think about a rainy November evening, a woman on a bench, and a question that changed everything. People sometimes ask me what I learned from all of this, and I tell them the same thing every time. The world will always give you 100 reasons to look away from someone who is struggling. It will hand you excuses wrapped in practicality, in exhaustion, in the very real pressures of your own life. But every so often, you are lucky. Someone smaller and wiser than you, someone who hasn't yet learned to overthink kindness, will ask a simple question that cuts through all of that noise. And if you are wise enough to listen, that question might just change your life forever. Mine did. It gave me a friend when I needed one most, though I didn't know it yet. It gave my son a grandmother figure who filled a space in his heart that grief had left empty. And it gave a woman named Verna Castello 8 more years of love, laughter, sunflowers, and family after she had nearly given up hope of ever having those things again. All because, on a rainy Tuesday evening, in a diner booth by the window, my son looked at a stranger and asked, "Dad, can she eat with us?" Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I still sit out on those back steps where Verna used to sit, watching the sunflowers sway in the breeze, and I think about how differently that Tuesday could have gone. Think about the version of that night where I told Hollis to finish his grilled cheese, where I looked away from the window instead of toward it, where a tired, grieving father made the easier choice instead of the kinder one. In that version of the story, Verna spends that winter on benches and shelter floors, and maybe doesn't survive it. In that version, my son never learns to garden, never learns to sit patiently with someone else's grief, never has a grandmother figure to walk him through the hardest years of growing up without his mother. In that version, I never learned that a ruptured appendix can be caught in time by someone who has spent a lifetime paying attention to children. I am endlessly grateful that we never had to live that version of our story. I hope if you ever find yourself in a moment like that one, sitting across from someone you love, noticing someone who needs a little kindness, you'll remember this story. I hope you'll remember that the smallest invitations can open the door to the biggest miracles. I hope you'll remember that families are not only built by blood, but by the choices we make to let people in when it would be so much easier to keep them out. And I hope, more than anything, the next time a small voice asks you a question like the one my son asked me, you'll have the courage to say yes.
Stories like this remind us that the smallest act of kindness can change our life forever. If this one touched you, let me know in comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Thank you for watching.